Let me welcome you to the first meeting this semester of the joint seminar, joint Brown-Harvard MIT seminar. This, incidentally, is the 13th year of the seminar, this joint seminar. Prerna Singh and I started it when Prerna was at Harvard 12 and a half years ago, and it has gone on, which is very good. Yes, you were there 12 and a half years ago.
I know,
yes.
Not
Yes.
12 and a half that I'm...
That's when we started this. And then Vipin Narang from MIT joined it, and he's right now at the Department of Defense, returning in July. So once he returns, the security meetings of South Asia seminar, joint seminar will take place at MIT, which has been our tradition, all security meetings at MIT. Anyway, welcome to the first one this semester. And let me also tell you who else is coming in this series. 2 weeks from now, Soledad Priliman from Stanford. She'll be at Harvard, speaking at Harvard, Patriarchal Political Order, the Making and Unraveling of the Gendered Participation Gap in India. Then Aidan Milliffe from on Understanding Majoritarian Violence, Evidence from Hate Crimes and Crowd Violence in India, and I'll be commenting on this. That's also at Harvard. Then Arvind Subramaniam and Devesh Kapoor, they have their new book on Indian economy is being reviewed by Harvard University Press, and it's commissioned by Harvard University Press. The review process has begun. They will be here at Brown and presenting 2 chapters from the book, one on growth and the other on public sector. And we'll be announcing the discussant soon. And then the final meeting will be at Harvard. Avidit Acharya from Stanford will come and speak on mass education and political mobilization, evidence from Nepal. And Prerna, I think, is the discussant for that in April. So that's our lineup for under the joint seminar label, this imprimatur. And look forward to seeing as many of you as possible in the 2 campuses. And once Vipin returns, then the security meetings at MIT too. There are at least 2 meetings every semester there. So it becomes 8 meetings per semester of the seminar. Today's speaker is Shikhar Singh, who is currently a postdoctoral fellow at CASI at University of Pennsylvania. Center for the Advanced Study of India, one of the oldest for the study of India. There are South Asia institutes and centers which are older. We are, of course, not as old. We are only 10 to 12 years, 12 years old. As a center of South Asia, we are only 8 years old. But that's where Shikhar is, and he has a Ph.D. in political science from Yale, and he is joining Duke University as an assistant professor of political science in July. That's how he will begin his career on the faculty as a faculty member. And the topic today is in-group anger or out-group ambivalence, voters and cross-ethnic distribution, a very important topic. And here is my formulation of it. Once brokers and intermediaries are taken away from welfare benefit distribution, and the digital infrastructure is deployed for cross-ethnic distribution of welfare. Do voters support the government regardless of ethnicity, or ethnicity still persists? It's a very important question, and especially given the rise of direct benefit transfer in India under the current government, and he is, if I recall correctly, the paper I read this morning, around 2017 or around 2016, a serious welfare distribution through the digital infrastructure began. Once bank accounts, zero bank balance accounts were opened virtually all over India, and banks were asked to, even if they didn't agree, they had to open. And that was the argument that the government made. Arvind Subramaniam is not here. He was involved with it, but I've sent him the paper, and he'll probably hear from him because he was involved with this whole idea of digital use of digital infrastructure for the distribution of welfare benefits minus intermediaries, minus brokers, on which there's a lot of material, including a paper we publish, Patrick Heller and I publish, and Siddharth. That was not a survey of 2017, it was a survey of 2013 or 14, Siddharth, right? In the American Journal of Sociology. But that was still the era of intermediaries and brokers, and we deal with that question. I will introduce the discussant later. We have someone who's also thought about these problems quite a lot, Fayyad Ali. I'll introduce him once the roughly 40 minutes of Shikhar we have. Welcome. Welcome, Shikhar.
Thank you, Professor Vashi. Thank you to the organizers of the Brown, Harvard, MIT seminar in giving me this tremendous opportunity to share my work. I'm really grateful to Pawan and Natalia at the Saxena Center for making this possible and for your very generous hospitality, and to all of you for your time and for your feedback and engagement with my work. So thank you so much. Let me start by saying that I study democratic accountability, more specifically how or under what conditions in which voters hold elected officials or politicians accountable. And in studying this question, I try and engage with what I think to be three big changes that are confronting developing democracies like India. One is the transformative change in the welfare landscape or state of countries like India, specifically India. The second is rapid urbanization. And then the third is serious threats from climate change. Today's conversation is focused on the book project, which looks at how transformative changes in India's welfare state affect ethnic voting, particularly how it has been characterized or conceptualized in the Indian context and broader developing democracies context. So let me start by actually describing what that model is. In much of the developing world, particularly countries like India, the dominant model of politics is often considered or described as ethnic clientelistic. This is a model in which, here's a picture from my fieldwork in some districts in India, where essentially an intermediary, a broker, delivers a benefit to a voter, which in this case is a gas cylinder, and there is a kind of explicit transaction in how that takes place, with an expectation for political support in return for the benefit being delivered. The key defining attribute of this model of ethnic clientelism is often that politicians who use brokers to deliver these benefits, the brokers have a pronounced ethnic bias in who they give the benefit to. And as a result, citizens have a preference for politicians from their own community or their own caste or group, because they expect to materially benefit from the election of said person. Clientelism in this case is explicitly structured along ethnic lines, and ethnic voting operates on an instrumental logic. The instrumental logic being, I vote for a co-ethnic because I get something in return for it, specifically something material in return for it. Now, India is often a prototypical example of this sort of ethnic clientelistic voting. Some of the canonical work in research has also been produced out of ethnic parties and ethnic voting in the Indian context. This has run into some sort of headwind in the last decade or so, if I can say, because of transformative changes in India's welfare state. In particular, there has been a move away from this broker-based, intermediary, discretionary, favoritism-defined mode of distribution to one that is a direct transfer that is increasingly based on objective rules. This distinction is not as sharp as I've just conceptually described it, but it is still important and perceptive in how the government delivers benefits. So, for example, you'll see that that existing governments in India make a point in their publicity campaign and other material to talk about how it removes middlemen and leakages, how there is accurate targeting, and essentially how this is a new era of transparency. Per estimates of, let's say, for example, The Economist magazine, there are about 300 plus different programs that distribute these sort of benefits to sorry, that distribute these benefits to a variety of citizens who are socioeconomically excluded and vulnerable. On last count, there have been some 950 million different people in India who have benefited from this range of welfare programs, and it accounts for about 270 billion US dollars in government spending since 2017. So big government spending, large number of beneficiaries, and a large variety of benefits that are coming with this. Incredibly valuable things are being distributed through this process as well. So in the rest of this conversation, I hope to focus on a housing program, which is called the PM Awas Yojana, and talk a little bit about what its political impact could look like. The key defining feature of all of this is that it is non-discretionary and for the most part based on objective rules reaching directly the intended recipients. Now, this has significant impact on lives as well. So here is some evidence from the field. What you see here is a picture of a typical recipient or a model recipient of the PM Awas Yojana house. One of the criterion for getting the house is that you must have none of the walls in your house should be made out of brick or any permanent material, so it's mud-based. The roof should not be pakka, as they would say in Hindi. And what you see behind is a kind of two-room cement structure that this beneficiary gets in the process of benefiting from the PM Awas Yojana. And for reasons that are clear, there is a big transformation between living in something in a dwelling that is like that and moving into one that is behind, particularly if you consider, for example, theft or torrential rain or other material circumstances that can affect an unsecured house or property of the former kind. Now, this rural housing program in one village alone that I'm showing you a picture of, there were about 145 new houses built under this program. And this is considerably greater than what almost all the prior housing programs in the previous 30 years or so put together would do in the same village. And beneficiaries for this housing program are chosen explicitly using socioeconomic data, which is the 2011 SECC data, not who the village pradhan knows, likes, or part of their extended kin network. And so, mapping back to the parent question, how does this kind of programmatic distribution, which I just described, affect ethnic clientelistic politics, the predominant model of politics, the characterization of politics in the Indian context, increasingly? So, the core intuition of the paper is basically split into two parts. The first, on the left side, is what is that model of ethnic voting, and then on the right side, how it gets affected by programmatic politics. So let me work through the two halves. On the left side is what would be the classic case of instrumental ethnic voting. So there is a politician who has some benefits distributed through an intermediary, and a underlying population with groups of different members, different groups, but for a stylized example, imagine two groups, and there is kind of preferential distribution of the benefit to members of their own group. Ethnic favoritism in distribution in this kind is well documented empirically in India and elsewhere, and is a key defining feature of politics in this model. This is why the members of this group have a preference for voting for a person from their own caste or group. Now, rule-based direct transfers do something very important, which is they take away the discretion of this intermediary and therefore weaken ethnic targeting. There's a built-in scope condition here, which I can reflect on at the end of the conversation, which is a sufficient inequality within castes so that the rules cannot perfectly proxy for group membership, which is satisfied in the Indian case for the most part. But essentially what happens is when you use data and rules to target beneficiaries based on, let's say, a socioeconomic criterion, you may distribute benefits to this set of people rather than people from a particular group. And as a stylized fact, the housing program that I just showed you or talked to you about 6 out of 10 beneficiaries in this were from essentially groups that were considered or typically considered outside of the ruling party's core support base. So in this case, Dalit, Adivasis, and Muslims. Okay, so this is the kind of the dislocation that is taking place. Why is the existing literature unable to explain what's going on? So the work or this entire change sits at the intersection of 2 important literatures, both rich, well-developed literatures. On the one side is the ethnic politics work, and on the other side is broader work in distributive politics, looking at transitions from programmatic to clientelistic politics. So within the ethnic politics literature, I think one of the key things that has defined this work is wedding a type of ethnic voting with a mode of distribution. In other words, ethnic voting is very much within a clientelistic framework in developing countries and has not been developed outside of it. And as a result, when cross-ethnic voting is studied, it is almost invariably studied by extending the logic of clientelism. So this can happen in a couple of ways. For example, if a person from group A would like to appeal to voters from group B, you can co-opt a person from that group, and then the logic of clientelism basically applies lock, stock, and barrel that point forward. Alternatively, there are instances where there is inadvertent targeting of benefits. So there is a non-excludable benefit that a politician wants to give to members of their own community. It so happens others are in the same community, they benefit, and therefore may have a reason to vote for that politician. And more recently, including colleagues in the poli-sci department here have done work on how accidental campaigning can have an effect on cross-ethnic voting. So I'm in a helicopter, I'm planning to go campaign to people in the in-group. I end up landing at a place which is predominantly by the out-group. What happens? Is there a backlash, etc.? So the kind of key limitation on the ethnic voting side when we describe this politics is it's always wedded to a mode of distribution, which is clientelism, and therefore we're not looking at how changes in that mode of distribution itself are affecting the logic of ethnic voting or nuancing the way we think about ethnic voting. There is, however, work that looks at when countries transition from clientelistic to programmatic, rule-based, non-discretionary distribution. This literature has typically focused on macro or societal conditions that are necessary for transitions to take place. So the emergence of a middle class, rising incomes, urbanization, reduction in the size of the state, etc. Where it has focused on individual level changes in conditions and how they impact political behavior, a lot of the evidence comes from the adoption of conditional cash transfer programs in Latin America, where ethnicity is not as salient a determinant of political choice. So as a result, in a way, India is an exemplar of change or a transition from clientelistic to programmatic politics in an ethnicized system where the ethnic voting model is active and salient. Okay, so what is the main contention of the paper or the broader project? I suggest that basically there are 2 challenges to ethnic voting that emerge as a consequence of moving to a rule-based direct transfer way of delivering benefits. And they're as follows. So if you remember, when politicians use objective rules to kind of distribute benefits to voters, you have a situation in which there are a lot of people from the same ethnic group as the politician who don't get the benefit. And this raises the concern for a backlash from in-group voters. And a lot of people from outside of the ethnic core of a political party who potentially do get the benefit, and uncertainty from the politician's side on whether they will be rewarded for channeling material or other benefits contrary to the expectation and prevailing paradigm to these voters. So the twin challenges to ethnic voting that then surface are essentially concern of a backlash from your core and uncertainty over reward from those outside who benefit from your distributive programs. And so in the rest of this conversation, what I want to focus on is how in-group and out-group voters respond to rule-based direct transfers by presenting some empirical evidence to you from the Indian case. Within this Indian case, I think there is reason to expect a lot of different things, but certainly a kind of adverse reaction from the in-group and some anecdotal evidence of reward or support from the out-group. So if we look back to policy shifts that have adversely affected the material circumstances of groups, particularly the in-groups that I will be talking about, there has been a history of a mobilization against policy shifts that had adversely affected their material interests. And increasingly in Indian editorials and even database journalism, there is work, and here is a smattering of headlines from some of the main and reputed newspapers of India discussing how beneficiaries of government welfare programs who are disproportionately from members of the outgroup, as I will characterize it, seem to be appreciative of the fact that they are getting welfare benefits and something has been done for them, and that this may have a kind of impact on the politics of the country when it comes to at least electoral politics. The answer that I will provide in the course of this kind of presentation is essentially that, contrary to that expectation of there being an in-group backlash and some out-group reward, there's actually no backlash from, as I empirically show, from the in-group voters of the ruling party, but it is the persistence of the kind of ethnic preferences of the out-group which creates an ambivalence on the part of winners or the kind of net gainers of the policy. So just to kind of give you a map of where the work is, ethnic voting is broadly situated within clientelism. This is a move to study how that voting and the logic of it operates in a different distributive environment, which is rule-based direct transfers. Within the rule-based direct transfers, one may expect going in that it's in-group anger or a backlash from your supporters for not preferentially treating them in the distributive process. But what we find instead is it's uncertainty over out-group reward that might be the principal political constraint that is acting on those implementing the project. I just want to say that this is part of a broader book project which looks at explaining how in-groups and out-groups are behaving the way they are, and I'll circle back to the specifics of that in the next steps at the end of the presentation. But two things that I would like to point out is, one, I think what is clear from these findings is that the instrumentalist model of ethnic voting that we have so far developed inadequately explains both the behavior of the in-group and the out-group in this particular instance, and increasingly of Indian political behavior. So there is a need to look beyond or to develop outside of the existing model. And second, I think a move to a more multi-dimensional model of ethnic attachment, which kind of draws on theories of both racial voting outside of India, but also social psychology and social identity theory, which are very often used to characterize identity politics in Western developed societies, but kind of material transactional ethnic logic prevailing in developing democracies, to bring some of that conversation into our understanding of ethnic voting in the Indian context. Okay, so very quickly, I'll start with a kind of, this audience needs no contextualizing, but some stylized facts that I hope to lean on in the context of the rest of the conversation. So India's ruling party currently, the BJP, was amongst other things elected on a good governance Sushasan platform in 2014. And in the course of this conversation, what I'm going to do is essentially define dominant or privileged and dominant castes as their core support base, and marginalized groups like Dalits, Adivasis, and Muslims as essentially outside of that core base. There are many ways to define this line. You could think of a kind of hard line on the grounds of, let's say, some other identity, or within a caste identity, a narrower definition of core, and future work will look at kind of like how it is robust to that definition. But for the time being, treat these as the in-group and out-group when I describe them. Even though India has made tremendous strides in terms of its changing the number of people who are living below the poverty line in the last 2 decades, about 80% of the population per World Bank estimate still live on less than $7 a day. And if we look at data on where the beneficiaries are coming from for a lot of these welfare programs, there is a lot of cross-ethnic dependence on welfare programs. So it's not the case that only some ethnic groups depend on welfare programs and some others don't. I think there are a set of voters in almost every ethnic group who depend on state-led redistributive programs as also resources. And this has implications for when we think of the trade-off in resource terms. And then finally, some might ask, why would a government ever get into using rule-based direct transfers in the first place when these findings seem to indicate that there is potentially not much immediate perceptive change in the nature of politics amongst the outgroup that you're trying to convince. And I think those have things to do with, one, an opportunity, which is expansion in state capacity because of digital public infrastructure, so better ideating on the part of policymakers, and a weak opposition, which means time horizons are slightly different from what we would expect in a highly competitive electoral setting. And I'd be happy to, again, come back to this when we discuss why some of these things might be happening. Okay, so I want to motivate 3 hypotheses for the purposes of the remainder of this discussion, around which I'll structure the empirical evidence. The first is on the in-group side, which is essentially that core supporters of the BJP, which is the ruling party, should punish it for substantially benefiting outgroups through the redistributive programs that I just described. Among the outgroup, in this case we'll focus on Dalits, there are 2 types of or 2 levels of responses when we think of rewarding. So the first is that outgroup beneficiaries should recognize and appreciate rule-based direct transfers. This is almost like an intermediate step for anything else to happen. And then a harder test, which is the core logic of ethnic voting, is basically having a preference for a co-ethnic politician. How does that change? Of course, this can't be electorally tested in the real world setting, so a behavioral game that mimics some of the conditions under which the kind of core logic of ethnic voting operates, to see whether there is a weakening of ethnic preferences amongst those beneficiaries. I just want to put one caveat out there before I even start, which is to say, it is not my contention that outgroups or in-groups should behave in one way or another. This is approaching it from a political perspective. What are the conditions necessary for the politics of this to be right? And groups are all enlightened and acting in their own kind of best interest, and there is no doubt on that. This is just a question of how do the political incentives line up, given or fixing how voters are responding, not putting a question mark at all on the wisdom of Indian or any other electorate. Okay, so with that, let me give you a preview of the findings. What I essentially find is that core supporters of the ruling party do not punish it for substantially benefiting outgroups. Among the outgroup itself, there is recognition and appreciation for rule-based direct transfers. So I think the first order condition is satisfied, but ethnic preferences don't weaken. And I'll provide you evidence from a set of survey experiments and a face-to-face study around a naturally occurring regression discontinuity design to kind of put some meat on the bones of what I've just said. With that, let me just jump straight into the first set of findings. So this was a survey experiment that was conducted online and via telephone. I'd be very happy to go into the exact details of how we field it, but you may think that an online survey experiment is kind of skewing urban, educated, and amongst the privileged and dominant castes, and that's absolutely right. This is a convenient sample to that extent, but it is also a theoretically interesting sample because that's exactly the set of the population that one would like to study the reaction of when we consider rule-based direct transfers. And so these survey experiments on the telephone side were conducted by C-Voter in 12 different languages. The idea here is to present voters with information about welfare achievements and to randomly vary the kind of information being presented. So among the control group, the gray information is presented, the information in gray, which is essentially that the Modi government has distributed nearly 17 million houses as of the date when this work was taking place. In the treatment group, essentially you receive the information or the text in gray and orange. The additional piece of information tells something about the composition of that beneficiary pool. In other words, a large number of people who have received the house are Muslims, Dalits, and Adivasis, and then exact number of people from each of those groups who have received a house under the welfare program that has been mentioned. This was done for more than one welfare program. And there are two outcomes of interest here. One is a kind of attitudinal question, which is a straight rating of the performance of the government on a 0 to 10 scale, and then a kind of semi-behavioral or a measure that mimics kind of a behavioral measure, which is if you had an endowment of 10 rupees, how much would you donate to the parties in your state? This always had the ruling party, but it also had other regionally competitive major players. So depending on which state you are in India, that number could be 2 or 3 other political parties. About 47% people in these studies did not want to donate even 1 rupee to anyone. So when I say it mimics a behavioral kind of measure, I think even though the money is not actually on the line, it's a hypothetical donation, a lot of it is perceived as if there were real stakes involved, and in this case, not very large real stakes involved. So 2 types of measures. And what I'm going to show you are basically the differences between the control and treatment group on these 2 outcomes for cohort supporters and outgroups. So how are they evaluating the current government behaviorally and attitudinally when they learn information about welfare programs? So let's start with the in-group voters of the BJP. Essentially on the left panel is the 0 to 10 performance evaluation. On the right side is hypothetical donations to the ruling party. In gray is the control group. 17 million houses were delivered by the government. In orange is 17 million plus who they go to. In this case, point to remember is that what's being emphasized and in piloting and other, I can say with some degree of certainty, learning rather than priming is essentially that a large number of these houses did not go to people like you. They went to people in other ethnic groups. So unsurprisingly, in-group voters rate the BJP government very highly. They're also primed to do so because we tell them the BJP distributes like 17 million houses, just shy of 8 out of 10. That performance evaluation is unmoved, in fact, only marginally higher, though statistically indistinguishable, when we look at those who have been told about the composition of that beneficiary pool. In other words, have been told the cross-ethnic nature of distribution. When it comes to donating to the BJP, there's a little bit of a drop. So I think this could be some amount of social desirability or kind of depending on how we're operating, why people are answering attitudinal questions. But a majority of that hypothetical endowment, a little greater than 5 out of 10, just shy of 6, is donated to the BJP. Just one second. And that amount in donating terms, hypothetically, increases, though not statistically distinguishable from the control group amongst those that learn of the fact that welfare programs have disproportionately benefited outgroups. I don't know.
Just a very quick clarification question. So when you're talking about the composition of beneficiaries, is there any reason why you don't use percentages? And what I notice is that in the control group you use million,
Yeah.
and in the treatment you say lakhs.
So it's all in lakhs. The million is just for the purposes of this conversation because that unit is a little like lost in translation. When it comes to percentages, it was piloted both ways. I think the more effective intervention was one where absolute numbers are described because the absolute numbers are big. Percentages could be operating on a low base, and that often is a kind of, can have a different effect. But both were piloted, at least in the early stages. Okay, so what about the outgroup? So you'll notice all the bars move down. Amongst the outgroup, even when interviewed in this setting. So on performance evaluation, the evaluation is about 7 out of 10, which is high. But note that this is not a pure control condition where we're asking people what they evaluate a government's performance. It's by giving some positive information about a welfare program. And that number, I'll just come to you in one sec, Sebastian, is unmoved when voters from these outgroups basically learn that welfare programs have benefited people from their own ethnic categories. In other words, there is no clear sign of rewarding.
Quick clarification.
Yes.
Are these participants all from different ethnic groups, or are they all people you think are core BJP ethnic groups?
So these are outgroups. In the previous one were all from different ethnic groups in that they are from different caste groups. But if you were from a general or an OBC category, which is the level at which this data was collected by the implementing firm, you're categorized as in-group. And for the rest, out-group. This is robust to a more multi-dimensional measurement of support, where you can bring in education, income, and potentially other kind of socioeconomic variables that are top predictors, urbanness, of support for the ruling party. On the right side is donating hypothetical donations to the ruling party, and as you can see, there is actually a drop. So now a majority of the endowment is not given to the ruling party, just less than about 4 out of 10. And again, no perceptive kind of change in donating to the BJP as a consequence of learning that redistributive programs have benefited people of your ethnic groups. Two quick things. One, these are well-powered tests to detect even small effects. So it's not that we're going in with a potentially underpowered test of like even small changes. And second, I'd like to note that at the start of this, the discussion was about outgroup beneficiaries, first-hand exposure to a rule-based direct transfer, not hearsay or a bystander. So this is not a true test of the second and third hypotheses insofar as this is about learning about redistributive programs happening to others rather than first-hand benefiting from those redistributive programs. So this is just shown because that data included members from those ethnic groups as well. But the real test is actually studying beneficiaries of a housing program, which is exactly what I pivot to now. Yes?
A quick question. So the experiment, the text seemed to be, it's almost what the in-group members believe the BJP says, right?
Right.
So, sabka saath, sabka vikas, and sabse.
Yes.
So do you think the failure in observing the outcome might be because you're not providing any new information in the treatment?
Right.
Which is, which is what they believe to be the case.
Yes. So I think so in two parts. When this was implemented, the specific rhetoric and publicity material that involved making claims about the extent of cross-ethnic distribution was still not happening. I think that started happening post-2020, 2021, 2022 more. But even in the piloting that was done on a set of people who were not included in this sample to ask what their instinct was, how these programs are delivered and who they go to, I think there is a hard prior about the involvement of intermediaries and there being some favoritism in who they reach. And I think that may begin to move now. I don't discount that, but with this treatment, that was not as much a concern of basically people already knowing that this is the case. If that was the case, those sets of voters are essentially being primed to think about this, and then the concern would be that the control group is also thinking the same thing, and I don't think in the piloting that is what was coming out. Okay, so quickly going back to the housing program then, this is a set of pictures from the field that I took. On the left is some field work from UP where you can see what a mud hut or house undergoes when there is kind of monsoon rain. So this has like serious repercussions, and for several of you who have done field work in India, you are no stranger to what I'm saying. There is a kind of threat to life and property. It affects school attendance. There is a kind of temporary shock to consumption, etc. And on the right side is a kind of prototypical house that you would receive under the PM Awas Yojana. This is not taken off the government website or any such thing. This is kind of based on my own fieldwork to tell you the kind of transformative nature of the benefit. In material terms, this is about 21 times the typical modal household incomes, outgroup household incomes, monthly income, which is at about $95 in the sample. And so this is a substantial and transformative benefit. And given the housing crisis in both urban and rural India, it's also a scarce benefit. If you do fieldwork on any of these communities and you ask people who have not got the house from various ethnic groups, I think there is a clear and present number of people who would like to get the benefit because of the nature of housing and the supply constraint in housing in India. Okay, so given this benefit, how do outgroup beneficiaries respond to the particular program. To study this, let me briefly walk you through a timeline which helps motivate the empirical design that was used, which is basically spotted during fieldwork with policymakers in India. And so essentially the rural housing program, this is not the urban one, this is just the rural one. Part one of the rural housing program, not the subsequent versions of it, because there has been a dilution of the original way in which it was done, and I'd be happy to talk about why that is happening and what that means for this, was implemented based on SECC data. So in 2011, India conducted a socioeconomic census. This provides fine-grained information about households, particularly their material conditions. In 2014, there's a change of government, and one of the things that it does is it basically uses this data to identify beneficiaries on a 10-point scale or score using components from that SECC data. This is done at the central level. That data is then sent to village assemblies to essentially check, because there has been some time elapsed between the census and it actually happening. The key thing to note is that that data is not sent explicitly mentioning the purpose for which this particular data has been cleaned. It was just a kind of administrative process where those that are duplications or those that are migrants or that have passed away, etc., are removed from the list. The village assemblies prepare this list. Once it comes back, it is locked into a government system, it is publicized, and then the government announces a housing program to say we're going to follow these lists to determine who gets a house. So the folks who have fine-grained information to precisely manipulate these lists are not the people making them. They have no power to add people to this list. One of the reasons why part 2 of this project took on a different form, that is the redistributive program. And the ones that do make the list don't necessarily have the same incentives or fine-grained information at the local level to precisely create the lists. Even so, what we're focused on is the implementation from 2016 through 2020, when essentially through a broader determinants of fiscal space, the government puts an outlay for the redistributive program, which ends up determining how many houses go to each village or community, which determines kind of where you are on these lists within each village. So in the last quarter of the year, you are at the end of the list, and the idea then is to essentially sample people on either side of this dividing line. So these are the people who get the house, these are the people who are next in line, and the list is kind of frozen. The next year's outlay will be defined in a budget, will kick in the second quarter of that year. So essentially, there is a plausibly as if random line separating those that have received a rule-based direct transfer, an expensive rule-based direct transfer, and those that have not. So this was a survey done on 530 households in 57 villages of Bihar, and it was a pre-registered strategy. I'd be happy to get into the details of what the mechanics and specifics of fielding the study were. A little bit about the fielding itself. So we are focused now on Dalits, who are defined as the ethnic outgroup, in a context where they are essentially mobilized to have strong ethnic preferences historically, and where the BJP is not the party championing their ethnic interests. In fact, if anything, if we look at the ruling party's vote share and support base in the context that we're studying, it draws heavily on the status groups that are opposed to the group that we're studying. It's only through alliances and other means that there's an expansion in social support base. I personally trained the enumerators, piloted the kind of questionnaire in 3 sites which are similar on a range of parameters in a neighboring, though different province, and then had a kind of 20 to 30 minute interview process. I just underscore that this was a logistically, as is the case with a lot of face-to-face surveys, a difficult task, because we were essentially going and finding people on a list which was pre-identified. So an enumerator on average walked like 4 to 7 miles a day and did only 3 to 4 interviews. So it spread over a couple of months to even reach the number that we did. And I was closely supporting and supervising the team as that happened. A few caveats before I show any results to you from this survey. So the first is, this survey happened on the eve of COVID. and was actually cut short by the first round of lockdowns. So there was an inability to basically go back into the field, and what that means from an estimation point of view or a kind of inference point of view is that there is a small sample and therefore potentially an inability to detect smaller effects. And a null effect is not necessarily proof of there being no effect because you're underpowered to detect that particular effect. These are areas that send a lot of migrants to other parts of the country. So one of the concerns that one can have with a study like this is those right above the cut point are inside, supervising the construction of their house, whereas those below are away, working. The survey was timed in such a way that it is in sync with the migration cycle, which is closely linked with the agricultural cycle, but also to ensure that we don't detect any asymmetry in the proportion of migrants on either side of that divide that I just described. And then finally, what I'll present to you are what are called reduced form estimates, which is basically the intent to treat, the government's intent to give you a house. I can run the same version of this analysis where you actually get a house, but for a host of reasons, there are a number of steps between getting, like, the intent being conveyed to you and actually getting a house, and compliance is, I think, north of 70%, but these results are robust to a kind of what's called a fuzzy RD setup where we factor some of that uncertainty. Okay, so very quickly, what are the three things that we do learn about out-group behavior from the housing program? So these are the three outcomes that I'll go and turn with. Imagine this is the list. The government is basically going down the list from right to left, so it's going like this. These are all the people who get the house. These are the people who are next in line. That's the line separating the two. And I'll show you results from two pre-registered specifications, but for the most part, let's just focus on the difference between the two groups at this point, which is the line separating those that do and don't get the house. So these are the folks that do get the house. These are the ones that are next in line. Okay, so the first outcome measure here is, has the BJP done something for you? Which is like a recognition of the fact that something has happened for you. And this was measured on a 0 to 4 scale, basically involving coins. So the number of coins that you put down is the more you put, the more you agree with the statement. And there is essentially a 0.6 to 1 scale unit increase. So in percentage terms, this is like 15 to 25 percentage points of the full scale. So a sizable increase in recognition that the BJP has done something for you among the outgroup that get the house. The next is, are they aware of the non-discretionary basis, programmatic basis for which this was given? So to do that, I have a number of measures which are collapsed together in an index, and that's a 0 to 4 index. And again, what you find is there is a 0.4 to 0.87 index unit increase in programmatic awareness amongst those that get a house. Again, in like percentage terms, this is about 10 to 20% of the full scale. There is an improvement in programmatic awareness. And then finally, there's a question.
Can I ask you how, tell us just a little bit about the programmatic awareness?
Yes.
What did you ask them exactly?
Right. So I asked them questions like, are you aware of the beneficiary list? Do you think there is broker discretion in who gets it? Do you think there's ethnic favoritism, etc.? And those are all kind of then pooled together to create this. And then finally, on gratitude, so I, for reasons of inference and social desirability, didn't directly ask people whether they themselves have gratitude, but said, do some people in your ethnic community voted for the BJP out of gratitude? This was retrospective, 6 months after the national election, and there's a kind of 19 to 22 percentage point increase in reporting gratitude within the ethnic group. So, taken together, what I suggest this evidence points to is there is awareness that the ruling party has done something for you. There is recognition of the difference in the way it was done, and there is some indication along the lines of the anecdotal evidence that journalists and others provide that there is gratitude for that fact. This then turns to the third and final hypothesis, which is how does it affect the logic of ethnic voting? To get it back, we use basically a behavioral game. This is a choose your dictator game, and I'd be happy to kind of not named with the Indian context in mind, but as an econometric kind of name. And the way that this works is essentially you are shown two hypothetical local politicians, so a different level of government from the one that is being otherwise studied. And the idea is that your payoff in the game, which is what you actually get in money terms, is linked to which of the two that you pick. And the information is controlled in such a way that the choice before every respondent is of two candidates. On the left side is a in-group, that is another politician from the Dalit community. And on the right side is someone who is from an out-group, queuing affiliation to the ruling party, principally through their attire and other features of their dress.
And the name.
And their name.
Jasad.
Yeah, exactly. And so, again, this was piloted in the 3 sites in UP to make sure that these two, like this is not interpreted as something else, and you know what it may be being interpreted as. There is a reason for not explicitly queuing party ID, which is the level at which this election is being described. There is no party identification. There is party inclination or affiliation. So to keep it realistic and also not too in your face, it's subtly cued. And this mimics, if we look at the kind of broad theoretical conditions under which ethnic voting, the instrumentalist logic is supposed to work, all of those. So let's say the Chandra 2004 et al. Logic of ethnic voting is in low information environments, which is what this is. We don't know anything about these two other than what I've just described. Politicians' ethnic labels, which are visible and sticky, will provide you some information about their distributive intent, which in this case is what they will pay you as a consequence of picking them, right? It's not an actual election, but it mimics the condition. And the expectation going in is that beneficiaries of the housing program should be more likely to pick the out-group politician, or certainly less likely to pick the in-group politician as a consequence of a rule-based direct transfer. So it's just a measurement of ethnic preferences at the end of the day, a behavioral measure of ethnic preferences. And what we basically find is that there is literally no difference, but a difference in the other direction, if anything, between those that get the house and those that are next in line. Now, there can be a series of reasons why there is no difference between these two sets of people. Many of these kind of try to anticipate and pre-register as explanations. So could people who are next in line anticipate getting the benefit, and therefore they're not responding because they haven't got the benefit, but because they expect to in the near future? We provide some evidence to show that the knowledge required to have such an expectation or the explicit measurement of that expectation does not lend itself to such things. There could be overriding other ethnic angles that are dominating voting, so we measure, animosity towards some other outgroups, etc., to see whether that might be dominating preferences. And so I'd be happy in question and answer and other session at the end of the presentation to walk you through why we're able to rule out a lot of those alternative explanations. Okay, so just kind of going back to the broad summary of what I started off with. Ethnic voting is mostly, if not entirely, situated within the clientelistic framework. This is taking it outside into a new distributive environment, which is rule-based direct transfers, and then documenting that it is not a backlash from in-group voters or lack of appreciation from out-group voters, but essentially the persistence of the logic of ethnic voting amongst that out-group that is providing the principal political constraint or consideration for those that are implementing these programs. It beckons a bigger question about why in-groups continue overlook, for example, redistributive programs that are benefiting others in an ethnic sense, and why outgroups continue to have strong ethnic preferences. And so the book project is developing some of these explanations. Let me provide some initial intuitions, and I'd be happy to kind of corroborate with evidence, both fieldwork and empirical hereafter. So I think for in-group behavior, some things to consider are: one, could there be other expressive identity-based issues that are being used to mobilize them, such that they overlook redistributive programs that cross ethnic boundaries? And I think this then gives a window into the multifaceted nature of ethnic identity and ethnic voting in India, such that it's not narrowly constrained any longer to just simple material appeals, but also to appeals of status or to appeals of kind of conceptions of a broader national community. There could also be, and actually there is empirical evidence in my work here, that there is in-group reward for efficiency. So I may not, or people like me may not be getting much out of the redistributive programs, but the fact that it is done with less corruption, more direct transfer and efficiently is something that I reward. This is a bystander effect, generally a kind of a good governance, a taste for good policy sort of thing. That's a small, minor effect, but it still is. So for some set of in-group voters, it could just be the fact that it is done more efficiently is worth rewarding, or certainly not worth punishing. And then finally, on the out-group side, why is it that the logic of ethnic voting is strong or appears to be strong? I will say that these findings echo a lot of the national and state level differences in the performance of ethnic parties in Indian elections. So it's not as if this is just a behavioral game. It's kind of corroborated by actual electoral data where in one set of elections there is large-scale ethnic de-alignment or cross-ethnic voting, but in state elections, ethnic parties, even in a state like Bihar, would do exceptionally well. And so it raises the specter of two things. One is there just hasn't been enough of this kind of distribution for those ossified ethnic preferences or logics to weaken. So that's just a question of time. When more of it happens, it will effectively then lead to an updating of the voters' prior or beliefs. And that's something that can be tracked, and I am. Or the other is this idea of contained gratitude, which is if level A of government does something for me, I have gratitude and support for level A, but it means nothing for my politics and preferences for another tier of government. That would be the kind of story that syncs with national elections playing out very differently from state and local elections, with ethnicity being a salient, even on instrumental grounds, predictor of vote choice in the latter two electoral levels.
In the latter two?
In the latter, that is
state and local.
State and local. That's right. And you know, evidence of, let's say, the RJD overperforming in electoral terms in a state election over the national election, the Samajwadi Party in a state over a national election would then conform to that kind of contained gratitude explanation. Okay, just some broad implications. I think the first one I have spoken about, but there is a need to basically situate the ethnic voting model outside of the mode of delivery and to look at ethnic voting in a more multifaceted dimension. This is actually essentially being said of countries like India, where hitherto the characterization has been very one-dimensional, focused on like an instrumentalist logic. A lot of folks pitch kind of technological improvements to governments these days, and they're in collaboration with big international organizations and others. And I think to them, the point here is there's a need to focus on the politics of rule-based direct transfers and these distributive changes rather than just on the governance outcomes. Because from the politician's side, essentially the bottom lines that are getting affected are changes in voter evaluation and support, and there needs to be greater scrutiny of that. I think the transition literature needs to engage a little bit more with the idea that in the West, if we look at, for example, Tammany Hall and the challenge to machine politics in New York and Chicago and elsewhere, these challenges come from below. They're the progressive clubs and others who kind of provide that bottom-up impetus for programmatic platforms to come in. But if the context that we've just described is one in which ethnic voting is particularly entrenched at that local level, a key pathway to reform that was accessible to the programmatic transitions of the past is blocked in several parts of the world. And so we have to think about how that might emerge in terms of like political entrepreneurship in these polities. All right, I'll just wrap up finally. The broader kind of portfolio of work looks at rapid urbanization and environmental challenges. So we have excellent work happening on big cities in India. It turns out a lot, if not most, of India's urban population actually live in smaller towns that look like this. And contrary to the initial promise of decentralization, where you expect greater political accountability, why is it that these small towns are so poorly governed? I have a set of work on that. And then finally, if you looked at the Lonely Planet Guide to Delhi, that's what you would be promised. This is what you would see if you were in some months of the year standing feet away from India Gate. So why is it that air pollution, which is immediate, intense, and lethal, is a political non-issue in India. So I have a set of work looking at why democratic accountability does not work in that context. With those words, I thank you once again for your time and look back to your feedback. Thank you.
You can now come here, right?
Yeah.
So, our commentator is Fayyad Ali, currently a postdoc doctoral fellow in the government department at Harvard and joining the government department in July as an assistant professor of government. He has participated in this joint seminar before and has been a regular participant actually, and we welcome him back. He received his Ph.D. from Stanford in 2023, and the current research is on democracy, identity, and intergroup relations. So there's a large intersection between what Shikhar does and what Fayyad does. And we'll all come here now because you made the presentation. Are you going to use a lot of this?
No, I'm just going to speak.
Fair. Next
Great.
10 to 15 minutes of yours.
10, 15 minutes. Okay. I'm going to sit. I just think that's easier. I clearly didn't get the memo that I was supposed to wear the same thing as Ashu and Shikhar while sitting up here. I'm just kidding. Okay. Thank you so much, Shikhar, for this presentation. I'm really excited to be commenting on this. Shikhar and I met for the first time when we were both on fieldwork in UP, so exciting to see this. I'm grateful I had the opportunity to read the paper. I learned a lot. I think it's well motivated from a theoretical perspective and, takes deep care to ensure the research design is sound. The writing is also very clear. Argument is sharply made. So I really commend you on the paper. And the presentation was visually very appealing. I'm going to summarize sort of my main takeaways and then give a couple comments. Some will be more broad, and a couple will be India specific. Some will be about the paper, and some will be a little bit about the broader project. So the paper argues that democracies are moving towards a rules-based transfer. It raises interesting questions for our existing theories of ethnic politics and distributive politics. I think the paper is notable in that it's zoomed in on really one of the most important changes in the study of Indian political economy in the past several decades. And this is the way that the welfare state has really shifted its mode of delivery. It's clear from many journalistic accounts, even from fieldwork in India, that essentially citizens are gaining access to welfare through direct transfers, where these middlemen or these brokers, who may have been subjective, are being cut out of the process. And I think you do a really excellent job of highlighting that change and why it's important. The paper argues that the shift to rules-based direct transfers occurs. There are implications for ethnic politics. In-group voters, or those who are core to the party, may feel slighted by the fact that out-group members are now getting material benefits, and they could backlash against the party. And then out-group voters, those who are not core to the party, may be pleased that they are getting these transfers and more likely to support the party, or they could be ambivalent. And in many ways, I think this question cuts across a fundamental consideration for parties, which is, can they do things that benefit a non-core group without upsetting the core group? And does actually, taking efforts to engage the non-core group actually matter? So the paper, I won't go into the two pieces because I think that Shikhar does a nice job of sort of outlining it in the presentation. But I think overall the paper suggests that, one, it is possible that there may be a dimension that is expressive, not just material, in voters' considerations, which harkens back to perhaps how Donald Horowitz discussed the psychological value of co-ethnicity. And it also highlights that this shift to programmatic politics could be obstructed due to the lack of reward that parties get, that out-groups don't, the lack of material benefits and the willingness of out-groups to reward them. So I'm just going to go through a few theoretical comments. So first, on the theory, the paper discusses this shift to rules-based direct transfers as a movement away from the ethnic clientelism setup, which is how we often characterize India. But I think that it's important to take a step back and think about what the types of material benefits clientelism as a concept highlights. So for example, when Kanchan Chandra discusses clientelism in her book on India, she considers it to be preferential access to welfare programs such as the housing schemes like Shikhar highlights, but also many other things like access to a government job, priority of building a road, access to a politician for help with some issues, and so on. And this suggests that even though there may be a shift to rules-based direct transfers, and it's still likely that core supporters could be getting other forms of clientelistic transfers, such as the government job, access to the politician, etc. For example, in my own work, field work in North India, some of these forms of clientelism seem quite relevant today, even when welfare is being done in a more objective manner. So should we expect the shift in welfare transfers to be the most important part of the clientelist benefits that the core supporters are getting? And given your focus is on upper castes and OBCs as core supporters, I wonder if they actually care more about these other forms of clientelistic benefits, like jobs or access to, the politician, less than they do about houses and gas cylinders. So I think it'd be helpful to describe the clientelism status quo and give us a sense of why our priors should be that changes in the direct welfare transfer in particular would be upsetting to the core. The second theoretical point is also related to how the paper is framed and written. I think increasingly scholars of India and other contexts have started to categorize voters as trading off between material concerns and expressive psychological or identity-based concerns. And this is something that comes up in your discussion when you lay out the implications of your findings, but I think the paper requires an earlier discussion of this. And I say this for two reasons. First, many scholars of India believe that at least some of the voting for the ruling party today is related to identity-based concerns. So it seems surprising that that's not presented from the outset. And second, I think there's a huge opportunity in the paper to highlight the contribution to this debate over material benefits versus identity and psychological concerns. And it may be the case that you don't want to fully engage this in the paper, but I think for the broader book project, it's quite crucial. A few comments linking the theory and to the design. So I think choosing to focus on the current ruling party, the BJP, could actually be an easy case to see limits to instrumentalist theories. And I realize that it's true that the ruling party is the one that has majorly transitioned to rules-based transfers, but they're also competing on dimensions of identity that seem absent from how in-group and out-group voters calculus when you enumerate the theoretical expectations and the hypotheses. And I wonder if you would find similar results by looking at a Yadav party like the SP or the RJD and their extension to material benefits to non-Yadavs using a rule-based transfer. And perhaps it's more likely that we see the instrumentalist theories there because they arguably are not making as many explicit identity-driven demands as the current ruling party. So I think this raises questions for you about what types of parties we would see these null effects in the experiments. And it provides you an opportunity to think about the types of parties that are able to move to rules-based transfers and not face backlash or garner out-group support. I think we need a clearer justification for the decisions on who the out-group and the in-groups are when we move from theory to design. The main analysis in the paper currently classifies the in-group as upper castes and OBCs and out-groups as Dalit, Adivasis, and religious minorities. However, and then some of the analysis also includes these economic and additional criteria in the appendix. But I think there are a few possible issues to think about in this classification, which I think you can think about when expanding the book project. First, if we're classifying based on who the BJP's initial core supporters were, then it seems like the core supporters would just need to be upper castes and not including OBCs. So, obviously there's been extensive work on the BJP as an elite party, which is primarily driven by their focused upper castes. But I also think if we look at, instances like post-Mandal Commission and the way that the BJP engaged with OBCs at that time, I wouldn't necessarily think that we'd consider them a core of the party, at least at that time. The second consideration is if we consider defining core supporters today, I think it's possible that upper castes may still be the only ones who could be considered core supporters, given that OBCs, I think in the 2019 election, upper castes were the most supportive of the BJP, and then we have 44% of OBCs voting for the BJP, 44% of Adivasis, 34% of Dalits, 8% of Muslims.
Yeah.
This is Lokniti's
72% upper caste.
Yeah, so I think that this could be helpful in thinking about how you want to make this categorization, but it suggests that, I would personally be curious if among the Muslim subset in your sample in the survey, if the treatment of stating that the ruling party provide housing to minorities boosts their willingness to vote for the BJP. And part of me actually thinks you may find some out-group approval in that particular context. Also relevant to design concerns and the focus on the BJP, I wonder if you can leverage some state-level variation in the sort of online and on-phone survey. For example, historically, the BJP has been considered more encompassing ethnic party in some states versus others. And so I think it's possible that there could be some variation in whether out-groups and in-groups get upset based on whether the BJP is conceptualized more as encompassing at the state level or less encompassing at the state level. A few more comments on study one. So I first want to commend you on the scope of that particular survey. I mean, the range of states, different languages, and you really take steps to ensure that the respondents are both attentive online and in the telephone sample. So I think this is actually an important model that people can follow when they do surveys both online and on the phone. In the survey experiment, the treatment here is mentioning the welfare policy helped Muslims, SCs, and STs. And I think someone mentioned this earlier in a comment, but I wonder if most voters are already aware of this. And you suggest that the fieldwork and the pretesting suggests that they're not aware that it's as expansive of distribution to outgroups. And so I think it would be helpful to sort of hedge on that sort of in the article immediately, because I think that's the initial concern folks may have with that design. I also say this because the BJP actually does a pretty great job of advertising that they administer welfare in a non-discriminatory way, as was shown by some of the examples in the start of the way that they pitch their gas cylinder and housing projects. Just two minor points on the outcome variables. I think the donation may be the preferable outcome variable because the performance evaluation of the BJP is actually relatively similar for both in-groups and out-groups, and it's not clear if those are statistically different. So it raises some trouble with thinking about whether we can classify those groups as indeed in-groups or out-groups. Now, a few comments on the second study. First, commending you on this RD design, identifying it in the field, and the care you take to do this. I also think this is a really good model of how to write a really clear and transparent pre-analysis plan and then execute on it well in a paper. Like, it was just very clear what you were doing at every step of the way. You also do a really nice job of addressing the threats to inference, both through formal tests, but also ground level knowledge of how this was implemented, which I often think is missing when we do these list level RDs. Sometimes we just take it as given based on a rule, and we don't actually speak to the people who are implementing this policy. So I think that's quite commendable. In this section, you zoom in to Dalits in Bihar who are considered outside of the core of the BJP. I might be saying this as someone who finds Bihar politics fascinating, and you may not get this from an Indian politics specialist, but I think in the paper you should provide a bit more context on how to think about Dalits in Bihar in this moment and historically. Like, initially they supported the RJD, then the JDU, and increasingly the BJP. But there's also the presence of the Lok Janshakti Party, which gets a significant portion of some jockeys in the Dalit population. And also in the 2019 general elections, which is just prior to your survey, Dalits actually, at a very high level, supported the BJP, and it was actually quite high relative to other states. So I think it could be helpful to think about, theoretically what Dalits in Bihar might mean, and explaining that a bit more clearly. I found the findings here quite interesting. Essentially, you're showing that Dalits show gratitude for the BJP and awareness of these programs, but they don't change their preference for a Dalit politician. You do a good job of addressing some alternative explanations, but I think one interpretation of your finding could be that Dalits are choosing between two options. The BJP, who has provided them a house, and a co-ethnic, who they also expect would provide them some sort of preferential welfare. So then the decision will generally have to happen on some other dimension if their expectation is that both groups are providing some sort of welfare. And so it makes sense for the Dalits to prefer some sort of co-ethnic, because presumably they would provide welfare, and then they're also going to provide some sort of ego rents or pride or some other psychological benefit. So I'm not sure if these findings are as surprising as they're framed, given that it seems like the prior would be that if the BJP is using rules-based transfers and a Dalit politician would give preferential treatment, that you'd get the same outcome from both groups. Okay, so just one minor point. I think when thinking about some other alternative explanations, I wonder if you could more deeply engage with the possibility that there's an ideological reason that people are voting for or are unwilling to change their vote from voting for their caste-based party to the BJP, and there seems to be a growing interest in the role of ideology in Indian politics. So I think that's an important counter explanation to rule out. And then just one last thing to highlight is that with the design right now, I think it tests the effect of giving things to outgroups through a rules-based transfer. And that's motivated by this change in welfare in India, but it doesn't test whether giving outgroups through rules-based approaches versus giving outgroups through discretionary way matters. And maybe we don't care about this because parties are not doing it in a discretionary way. But I wonder if we would actually find that in-group members would be quite upset if you told them that a party was giving out goods in a discretionary way, right, rather than a rules-based way. And I think this can help in the broader book framing as we think about this transition from clientelism and programmatic politics. More broadly, I think you may have to make a decision on whether you want to articulate the identity dimension as a mechanism that is driving some of the effects that you find. But regardless of how you move forward, I think this is incredible work, really deeply researched and well argued, and I look forward to seeing more of your work in this space and citing this paper. Thank you.
Do you want to respond now or hold off and?
Whatever is practice, I'd be happy to. Why don't
Yeah, let's collect. Huh?
Sure.
Yeah. So let me also say a few things.
Yes.
First, the question that you've chosen, the problem you've chosen, is an extremely important one, and I commend you for zeroing in on this topic, the transition from one kind of welfare state to another kind of welfare state. This is very, very important, and the clarity of the term that appears in mind is radical clarity. This is how clearly you presented your materials, and of course, one has to admire that kind of clarity. Now, maybe a couple of things. One something very small. First, you say 80% of India is at less than $7 a day. You'll have to tell us at what prices.
2011.
2011 prices.
Yeah, I think that's the constant prices that they use.
Yeah, so 2011 is what they use for poverty line at 190, World Bank, and 2017 prices they've given us at 215. 215, if you're below 215 a day,
I see.
at 2017 prices, 2017 prices, then you're below the poverty line, according to the bank. So just what this $7 a day,
Yeah.
the $7 a day is 560 rupees a day today, right?
Yeah.
By today's logic. And what if you're saying 2011 prices, then this is probably, by today's prices, it could be 12, 11 or something like that.
Okay.
11 a day. So just to give a sense of, $11 a day today will be 900 some a day per person. Certainly by Indian standards, it's not very low, 900 a day, right? So it's about sort of 27,000 rupees a month per person, right?
Yeah.
And if it's a family of 5, then multiply that for 5. So I think give us a sense of that.
Sure.
It's $7 a day at 2011 prices is not really a sign of very low income. That's what the point is, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now, some conceptual issues here, and then I'll expand further on what Fayyad said about how to think about OBCs or their core constituency or not BJP, right? So, first of all, you're certainly not using clientelism in a very technical sense, which is an individualistic bargain between a voter and a broker or a voter and a party, right? You are using it in a very Kanchan Chandra sense, which is patronage rather than technically what clientelism is, right, which emerged from Latin America. And if you read Stokes and Tad and Dunning et al., they also say that the local level party worker can actually police whether that particular claim nobody has accepted fully. And they themselves say that the local level party worker is saying that the 55% chance that we can predict, I think it's 57% chance that we can predict whether the person we benefited voted for us. That kind of policing, right? It's not, in any case, you can't do it in India. That's very hard, right? So I think you're using clientelism not in that sense, you're using clientelism in the patronage sense. Group-based distribution of goods, right?
Yes.
Which is how Kanchen describes it, a patronage democracy, right?
Yes.
And so it connects with clientelism as a family resemblance, but technically, conceptually, it's not the same. Right? That's all. This is I think roughly the same purpose it serves, but technically it's not the same, right?
Right.
Then in the clientelism literature, there is at least if you go through Jennifer Bussell's constituency service idea,
Yes.
which is not hers, which comes from Richard Fenno.
Yes.
Right. Richard Fenno's great book, I think it's called Homestyle
Yeah.
and Soaking and Poking,
Yes.
when he followed congressmen from the district to the
Yeah.
to the hill and then back.
Yes.
And that's when the idea of constituency service became very clear, right?
Yes.
So even Bussell is saying that if there's substantial constituency service, and we not in our rural work, we haven't done rural work, we did in urban work. In our urban work, if you see our AJS paper and what is going to appear very soon, constituency service is fairly substantial. How much exactly? How did we will get Siddharth maybe?
60%.
Huh?
60% go on their own.
Yeah.
30%, 40% go through an intermediary.
Right. So you will get this. The constituency service complicates this, right?
Yes.
Which is that, and I also recall that Thachil and Auerbach in their latest work
Yeah.
are saying that the local level worker is not doing it only for the ethnic group,
No.
right? And he is basically trying to move up the party hierarchy, and the more votes he can deliver, the more the greater the chance that he can move up the hierarchy and perhaps get a ticket
Right.
to run for office, right? So then his incentives are not structured in a very intra-ethnic way.
Right.
He has to deliver more votes,
Yeah.
right? And so they're saying that from the slums of Bhopal and from the slums of Jaipur, the two places they study, you're getting actually cross-ethnic behavior by the local broker or local party worker, who is also playing the broker in some sense, right? So I think the constituency service idea complicates this and might have to be brought in. In what way, I don't know in your work, but conceptually it's required
Yes.
when you deal with the clientelist literature, right? Then another conceptual point, when you say instrumental versus expressive, I know it's much better to have two categories than only one, which is instrumental.
Right.
But, there is if you go through Max Weber for the conceptual food, enrichment, then you get not only instrumental rationality, you get another kind of rationality, which is value rationality, right? Which he also calls rational, but in a very different way, in a very, very different way. And then expressive for him is two things, normative and impulsive. Right? So you can say, of course, having expressive versus instrumental is a good way to problematize instrumental, because when I was going through my early days as a faculty member, rational choice has taken over the discipline, and everything was instrumental. There was no non-instrumental behavior, right? Everything was instrumental. So it's much better to have expressive come in, and much better to have Donald Horowitz brought in, right? Because he goes in that direction, and the psychological and social identity theories. But there is at least 4 motivations in Weber which you might want to just refer to,
Absolutely.
even if you don't want to buy all 4 categories.
Yeah.
But he is very insistent on those 4 categories, and they're very different kinds of behavior, right? Different kinds of behavior, and maybe on voter behavior they apply. I don't know. But certainly the human behavior, he says there are 4 different kinds. Whether that apply to voter behavior is something you might have to sort out.
Yes.
But conceptually it will be very, very important to get into that. Now finally, OBCs, are they a core group of the BJP? You took Dalits out. You said Dalits are an out group, Muslims are an out group. I think that's fair in my view, even though one should note that every third Dalit in 2019 voted for BJP. Or Modi, right?
Yes.
And 44% of OBCs, that you just summarize, if that data is right, we can't disaggregate to the state level because the size was only 10,000. This will also could be a response to him. If your size is only, telephone survey is what? How much? What's the size?
5,600.
That can't be disaggregated at the state level. That's a nationally representative, but can't be state representative at the state level. You'll need something like 35,000 to do state level representativeness, right?
Yes.
So anyway, their sample is about 12, I think. 2019 sample is 11 or 12, yeah.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, so that's nationally representative.
22,000. NES 2019.
That does give you some possibilities.
Yeah.
22 is large enough to give you
I think
some
the
state
NES
level. But anyway, what they say is that every third Dalit voted for BJP.
Yes.
44% of OBCs voted for BJP. 72% of upper caste voted for BJP. 8% of Muslims voted for BJP. Right? So, the Adivasi population is also 42, right?
44.
44%, the same as OBC. This creates issues.
Yes.
Now, if you go by the Golwalkar Hindu nationalist ideology, then only the upper caste are the core group. And caste structure is to be defended in the Golwalkar model of Hindu nationalism. In the post-Golwalkar model of Hindu nationalism, when people like Govindacharya come in, Govindacharya had to be expelled because of some personal reasons, not because of the ideological reasons, right? As a Pracharak, Govindacharya should not have had an affair with Uma Bharati. That's the reason he was fired. As Pracharak is supposed to be celibate. This is the requirement, right? So as a Pracharak, he had that. That's why he was fired. But the idea was social engineering. Social engineering, the concept of social engineering, according to Govindacharya, which was followed later, is that lower castes have to be brought into the Hindu fold. Something that Mr. Modi talks about all the time. Right? So OBCs are clearly out then under Golwalkar and Dalits. And OBCs acquire a very different color in the post-Golwalkar Hindu nationalist ideology if you read the text, the ideological text. And you could possibly say that OBCs are part of the in-group now. You could say that. I don't think it's entirely wrong. But it's problematic for the following reasons. That ideologically, certainly that's what they want. And ideologically, they also want Dalits as part of the Hindu fold. Right? Because they should be part of the Hindu family. So remember when Akhlaq was lynched in Dadri, Mr. Modi didn't speak at all. When in Gujarat, what town was it? Dalits were lynched, not to death, but to severe injury. Gujarat town was called, very soon thereafter, he gave a speech in Bhopal. And you can still get it on YouTube. He said, दलितों को क्यों मार रहे हो मुझे मारो. He said that. दलितों को क्यों मार रहे हो मुझे मारो, तो हमारे समाज का भाग है, अभिन्न भाग है. As Hindi is very Sanskritized by now. वो हमारे समाज का अभिन्न भाग है. When the Muslim was lynched, he didn't say हमारे समाज का अभिन्न भाग है. Right, so there is a sense in which this is post-Golwalkar Hindu nationalist ideology, which is trying to include OBCs and the Dalits also. Right. However, when it comes to actual electoral strategy, as you have noted, you must have noticed from the available literature, they do not aim at Yadavas all that much. They aim at what are called lower OBCs. Right? They do not aim at Jativs, the upper Dalits, as much as the lower Dalits. They have created all these categories. Right? Once you say that, then how exactly are the OBCs an in-group? Ideologically they are. So you can defend it that way. In their ideology they are. Right? But in the electoral strategy are they? I don't know the answer to it. Would be as straightforward as this. It would have to be something like upper OBC and lower OBC. Every time, so I'm there for every national elections for about 2 weeks before, and I travel basically from Lucknow to Varanasi. And that is about 14 days it takes, going through the villages, Sultanpur, Raebareli, etc., and then end up in Varanasi, where the last speech typically is, right? And you talk to those villagers, not in a very properly sampled way, and this is very clear to them that lower OBCs, Mr. Modi wants. Upper OBCs, even if he wants, he won't be able to get them. Yadavs won't come. Yadavs won't come, and Pasis would come. Pasis actually lower Dalit, they would come. Now wale will come. Right? Now wale will come. Bal kaatne wale, nai will come. So this has to be somehow figured out. I really don't know what it means. I'm just raising some issues for you. I don't know what it means for your categorization about what is an in-group for BJP. Ideologically, I think you're right. But ideologically, even Dalits are an in-group. And so are the Adivasis. Only out-groups are the minorities, especially the Muslims. It is a creation of a Hindu Rashtra where all castes are welcome. And even Adivasis should feel like they're Hindu, but non-Hindu minorities are not welcome. Ideologically, right? But electorally, the strategy does not exactly that. So let me stop there. Yeah.
Do I take the question?
Yes. No, I can take the question, but do you want to respond now?
Yes,
you
sure.
have 2 sets of responses.
Absolutely. Well, firstly, thank you both Fayad and Professor Vashni for these really super helpful and important questions. I think, let me say a few things. The first is, I see the categorization point as essentially one where the book project will develop as you, I think, importantly point out, the multiple ways in which these boundaries can be defined. And I think the best way to do this would be to have a robustness to both, where there is a targeted sampling of certain areas and groups that are well understood to be within or outside of the ethnic divide in the context in which they're being studied. So I think that merits a face-to-face survey. It merits it not at a national level, but in a very local level. And then doing 2 or 3 of those so that there is variation on the flexible definition of in-group and out-group that you have just described. And I think that's exactly the next step that I would want to take this. In an empirical book chapter, this would be the kind of overall finding with the weakness that because it is transcending state boundaries, there is a hazy definition of the group boundary. And then the next step would be to maybe go to UP or Bihar, the context that I've studied and known better, and focus on the 2 types of boundaries that we've just discussed. So that is definitely a weakness in that the conceptualization of this needs to be, and the empirics of it need to be robust to both definitions. I think on your point about clientelism in the strict sense and clientelism in the kind of patronage sense, this is also important in how I describe it in the paper, because I know that the Latin American model is not necessarily how clientelism is characterized in the Indian context, and therefore being clear that it's essentially a group-based patronage system, as you described it, is what is being described and called, not the Stokes-Dunning et al. Model, where I think for a variety of reasons that's a completely different kind of, within the same family, but completely different politically process. Constituency service I've actually struggled with, because this is a tough one. It provides a lot of soft services representationally to voters, which are, if we look at Jennifer Bussel's work, not ethnically targeted, actually not even targeted by partisan lines either. And so in that sense is a service to everybody. And I guess my response to that would hinge on something to do with, one, the portfolio of behaviors that politicians practice. So some are more inclusive than others, and that inclusivity goes as resources get scarce. And so potentially on constituency service related matters, the resource constraint is much less tight. And as a result, the discrimination is much lower. But it's tricky, and I'm not fully sure how to situate the empirical work of constituency service within this thing, but it has to be done, and I think that's a challenge. And yes, definitely we'll go back to Weber and Marx to clarify the other motivations, and it is important because I think particularly things like normative and impulsive are increasingly visible as predictors of preferences and have not necessarily been built into, and to that extent shouldn't just be a dichotomous kind of instrumental versus expressive, which is how it has been set up.
Yeah.
And as you're pointing out, it's not necessarily for the best reasons that it should continue that way in how we frame it. Fayad, your points are exceedingly helpful and really important. I'm just flipping through some of the kind of the key ones that stay. I think the types of benefits under clientelism and programmatic distribution is an important one, particularly if there are offsetting benefits that are going to members of other groups. I think the house was picked initially with the intention that it is such a big thing and one-off thing that governments do that the danger of it's unlikely that a government will give the same person 2 houses. And so it's a one and done type of thing, and to that end it is scarce, valuable, etc. But if there are other avenues where in-groups are essentially getting compensated for distributive largesse, then I think that's worth noting and detecting. I think that would be an important reason to explain the behavior, but it would go pretty much along the clientelistic line that we have, or the patronage line that we've described. So an important alternative explanation to deal with.
Job access would be one of the points that Fayad was making.
Yes.
I would also commend that that's a very important matter.
Yeah.
Job access versus getting a house.
Yes.
Is there something going on there which is important to note in explaining voter behavior?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, $2,000 is a lot of money.
Yes.
80,000, so that's about 1,60,000. That's what they're getting.
Yeah,
That's a fair amount of money in the village.
Yeah.
Right? That's fair amount, but is the job a bigger deal or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Is the job a bigger deal? And look, in American populism, this is a very serious matter. The goods from China the imports from China made everything cheaper. Your clothes, your shoes, right? But they've taken the jobs away.
I see. Yeah.
Right. See, the middle America is devastated job-wise, but it's getting very cheap goods. The shoes are cheaper, clothes are cheaper, right? Toys are cheaper. Toys R Us is all entirely. It used to be made in China, right? So all of those are cheaper. Yeah. So there may be something like that going on here.
Yeah, I think
jobs versus houses, or jobs versus cooking gas.
Right.
Yeah.
I think the NES data will be helpful here. I have looked at percentages of various caste groups that are dependent on welfare programs, which is where I motivated one of the scope conditions that I outlined in the talk. But I think job is not one of them, so it would be important to kind of bring that in and see how things.
Unemployment rate, to add to this, is very high in India right now, despite all the benefits. Benefits are coming in large numbers, but unemployment rate is very high. This paradox is a very important one. Yeah.
Yes. I think on Fayad makes a very good case for studying the behavior of Muslims, and I want to do this, but I don't think a survey is the best way to do it. So my kind of approach to that is through essentially qualitative fieldwork with beneficiary families and those proximate in the community to get a sense of, not in a kind of walk into a setting, ask 5 questions and understand, but a more kind of sustained, in the sites that I've been doing, sustained fieldwork going back, and then with some degree of trust having an ability to get the nuanced reflection of beneficiaries who may not be as, that may not be as well captured in a survey setting. So that's certainly one of the...
Focus groups will be a very good idea.
Yeah,
will be a very good idea. A focus group with about 10 people or 8 people. That will be a very good way to sort this out. A focus group for about 2 hours, it gives me a lot of data, which I can't get through surveys.
That's great, and I think I'm inclined to go down that kind of that route. Yeah,
Okay,
I
let's
can come back to a lot of those, but why not?
Other questions? Who would like to comment or ask questions? Critiques, comments, questions. Sebastian.
Right. Can I ask a few small questions?
What?
Can I ask a few small questions?
Yeah.
Okay. My first is a very general question, which has to do with why this change is happening in the first place. So I think the discussion has hinted that this may be a part of the BJP's actual strategy, and work by Tariq, Thachil, Shikhar's forthcoming book would suggest that's true.
Yeah.
But there's also an element in which technological change has really made this possible, and now people have these bank accounts that they wouldn't have had before.
Right.
And so maybe that suggests that this phenomenon of providing goods in this way more broadly would apply beyond the BJP to other parties.
Yes.
And then turning to your first study, it seems like the groups that would be the most likely to drive backlash, the people that would be the most likely to drive backlash, would be the core group members for the BJP who are also potential beneficiaries, because they're the ones who, would have been favored in the distribution in the past and are now subject to maybe worse chances of receiving the good.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering if maybe in this data, if it's possible, or if in future work you could zoom in on that particular group, especially because the BJP has such a relatively wealthy group of supporters, and so they might, be more okay with people who other people receiving the goods, since they don't expect to receive it. Then my last question is, in your second study, this kind of non-finding about the salience of ethnicity. Do you think that this is a durable non-finding, or do you think that this change is so new, the shift to programmatic distribution is so new that expectations haven't updated, but they will update, in the coming decades? But thank you for a really fascinating and thought-provoking.
No, thanks,
talk.
Sebastian. These are
Let's take some more. Yeah.
Okay, please.
Manu.
Yeah, again, thank you, Shikhar.
Hi, Manu.
So just to, I think that's something that Fayad spoke about, Sebastian. So, you would expect backlash on issues which are, so let's say, within group issues of reservation, for instance. Really kind of thinking about that, what your treatment one is doing in terms of providing what kind of information, which was the initial comment as well, I think would be giving them questions or giving them voters information about issues that they might care about more. So, reservation, jobs, I think you would expect to have more backlash.
Yeah.
The second question I had was that, I would really need a little bit more of the evidence on the rule-based nature of that allocation, right? So, I mean, even in some of the fieldwork that we do, we find that the sarpanch does have some discretionary power over who gets the housing. And it's a weird kind of an equilibrium, because in the villages they say, sarpanch is from my caste, 5 years rotation happens, and then it'll be another community. So there's this weird equilibrium that, if I don't get housing right now, perhaps when my guy becomes a sarpanch, I'll get the housing. But I think we need a little more, evidence on why is this rule-based nature allocation, especially in cases where, local discretionary practices are rampant. The third point was, so again, going back to what Fayad was pointing out. So, context matters. For any Bihari, the picture that you showed was Paswan and Jha. And Paswan is LJP. So, going back to who are the Dalits in Bihar, 16% of the population. Nitish Kumar comes in, bifurcates the population into two, Mahadalits and the residual. So Mahadalits are your usual, and the residuals are your Paswan. And I feel like in my mind I'm thinking that space for who gets the Dalit vote is already saturated. There is LJP and there is JDU, which is getting the Mahadalit vote. And they don't want to vote for the RJD because it's primarily another ethnic-based party. So the question really is, it would be interesting to see whether the BJP is even competitive for the Dalits. So if the BJP was a competitive party for Dalits in Bihar, perhaps you would see, this relationship between receipt of benefits would perhaps, weaken ethnic preferences.
Isn't it competitive at the national level? You're saying at the state level it's not.
I'm saying, yeah. So
at the state level and local level, right?
At the state and the local level.
Yeah.
Also that, I'm not sure how much of the effect is blurred, given that LJP, JDU have always been with the BJP. So if I'm a Bihari and I see that picture of the LJP of Paswan, and I assume that's, the Lok Jan Shakti party, and then the other side is Jha, who's BJP, I'm not sure, am I voting for the same party or am I voting for a
I see.
different party?
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Fantastic paper, thank you.
No, thank you. Thanks, Sebastian and
Can I
and
just
Banu.
put two finger very quickly on
Yeah,
that,
yeah,
Shikhar? So, I kind of had very similar questions as kind of both Sebastian and Bhanu, and yeah, also because I was just kind of wondering if you could tell us a little bit more, kind of following on Bhanu's question about like Dalits in Bihar, also just in terms of their representation. This follows on Professor Vashni's points about the kind of expansion of the BJP from its original formulation of upper caste to now kind of including Dalits. Like, what does it look like in, like, we know that Dalits are courted and vote for other parties. And so, because, when you show those two pictures, one is very clearly a partisan kind of subtle queuing with the tilak and the scarf, and the other doesn't have a partisan queuing, but has a kind of neutral caste. Again, I looked at past one and I was like, how would I read this? But can you tell us just a little bit about the place of Dalits in Bihar, in the BJP? Like, what proportion of seats were given to Dalits to contest? How many won? What does it look like in terms of the affiliation for local level elections? Of course, there won't be like, or even party membership, like just a little bit more of the kind of descriptive landscape of where Dalits fit within the BJP. And then I was wondering if some of the work on retrospective voting might be useful for you in terms of the non-finding of like, they're aware, they're grateful, but it doesn't translate. And so part of me was kind of Sebastian's question, is this simply a matter of time? But then I was thinking, maybe it's not a matter of time, and maybe it's not surprising because, retrospective voting is such a phenomenon in other parts of the world, and the data on that has always been, like the data I know is on Tamil Nadu, which has been doing what the BJP is doing for decades and decades earlier. So in the 50s and 60s, it wasn't really clear whether there was, if you got a wash, like a mixie grinder, right, that was the classic one from the AIDMK in the 60s, 70s, 80s, would it translate into AIDMK voting? So I'm wondering if you can just situate the lack of the finding in the kind of general landscape of the effectiveness or lack thereof of retrospective voting for other parties that have kind of done similar, it's not cash transfers into bank accounts, but it is kind of, not programmatic, non-directed, it's like a mixer grinder for all women. But yeah, I think there might be something there for you to be able to locate that finding and try to understand it a little bit.
I must add, though, I like the concept of constrained gratitude very inviting. Despite the relevance of all these questions, constrained gratitude is a very interesting concept you're developing. And I hope it turns out to be right, but if it turns out to be right, you can own that concept. It'll be a Shikhar Singh concept, constrained gratitude. Yeah.
So I'll probably take these in some order as I wrote them. So why is the change happening in the role of technology? I think, Sebastian, you're absolutely right that the digital public infrastructure push in India has certainly provided inspiration to a lot of bureaucrats and policymakers when they are thinking in terms of how to implement policies. So there is an element of state capacity enabling visualization of programs to go a certain route. The best instantiation of this is that the rural housing program actually did have, I think, a Secretary Rural Development who was particularly inclined and interested in using some of these new capacities that were built. But there was a housing program that was done in the urban area, which is also PM Awas but urban, which did not follow this rollout at all. I mean, had none of the elements of what I just described. So I think to that end, the role of individual actors at important positions, including the political positions, is important and I think should not be downplayed. It's not this is not an instance of bottom-up pressure leading to significant improvements or transformation in the welfare state. So the backlash could be driven by outgroup beneficiaries. I don't think the NES data is going to help me with that. So the question then becomes, can I collect data on outgroup beneficiaries? That was the original plan, which was essentially within the same locality to have
Did you say outgroup beneficiary or in-group?
In-group beneficiaries.
In-group
Sorry,
beneficiary.
I have that wrong. Comparing in-group and out-group beneficiaries, and I think part of that is constrained by the inability to go back into the field, but it can be done now for other programs, particularly the ones that are being launched. Because I think one of the things that the government is doing successfully is this saturation approach. What that means for researchers is an inability to go back into the field and have any control group. And this is something I struggled with as well. When lists are actually being saturated and completed, there is a difficulty in necessarily identifying those that are eligible but not yet benefiting. And it has to be done quickly within like a year or two of the launch of a program. So I think for a forthcoming program with that, it's something that can be done. For the PM Awas Yojana, I think they've exhausted the list. And there was a point later on about, Bhanu makes the point about how rule-based is it. Actually, the fact is that the initial list that was made, which was led to the delivery of the first set of houses, followed as close as you can get to a programmatic script. But the awareness that intermediaries were so disempowered in that initial process then led to, but we knew of other people who could get the house. We have an alternative list of people who should have got the house, which is what led to the expansion of that housing program, and subsequently not the same strictness was followed in implementation. And that's also a story of like how these transitions can be incomplete or even partly reversed when the involved actors become aware of their being essentially bypassed. And we'll have to see whether that is what ultimately happens here, where there is a first wave of programmatic implementations, and then for political or other reasons, the entrenched actors find their way back into the system. The other piece of evidence that I have that speaks to this is the survey includes a lot of work on do you need intermediaries to do certain things? And I think while the money directly reaches the account of the beneficiary, the selection itself does not depend on the information, embedded actor information that a broker provides. The fact is that a lot of the people receiving these benefits tend to lack, say, confidence to access the market. And in those places, there is still involvement of intermediaries. So I have taken
the cooking cylinder. Gas cylinder comes sometimes through.
Yes, in fact, in the dissertation, there is an entire kind of compare and contrast where for one scheme, there is involvement of intermediaries or brokers, party activists, and others not. So I think for analytical clarity, this has been presented as like a stark contrast. The fact on the ground is that every scheme has elements of programmaticness and clientelism, whether institutionally or creeping in practice. Is it a durable finding, or is it likely to go? I do think that this was kind of a hard test put early on, hard test in that for ethnic preferences to weaken, with subsequent kind of iterations of other benefits going through the same way, and there being a change in the kind of way other governments approach with some variation on parties doing this, there can be scope for this to change. And so I definitely don't think that this is like a conclusive assessment of ethnic voting. It will take time, which I'll have to sit out and wait and see how it plays out to see whether there is a weakening over time. But we will have the first data point from this, that a couple of months or years into it, nothing, and then follow up by others and hopefully me would be able to see whether there is a kind of change over time. Just on the Dalit politics of Bihar and how to situate Dalits in the context. So I actually don't have the figures, Prerna, that you requested. I should get them at least on the slides on the proportion of BJP candidates that were Dalits, and the party membership statistics I imagine are harder to get, but I'm sure the BJP has, as they do with their candidate lists, maybe some description of the social basis of their membership. Okay.
Last question will be his, yeah.
Okay.
Then we'll break. We cannot go on for more than 5 minutes.
Oh, okay. So sorry. Just all of which is to say, the districts that I picked actually picked with some sense of variation on the position of Dalits in Bihar politics. So one of them is actually a stronghold of the Congress, in eastern Bihar, where very much you would expect Dalit mobilization not to be as part of an NDA kind of conglomeration, howsoever defined, with Nitish Kumar being in or out. And another set was actually in an area where there is variation on this. And the idea was in the original data collection to actually split the data by the pivotality of the Dalit vote to the BJP. But with 530, essentially what I'm compelled to do with an N of 530 is treat this as a single unit and just analyze it as such. But I think the NES data has a few thousand data points, so maybe there is something to be done at least observationally on this count with a larger sample frame there.
It'll be about 15% of 20,000, right? 21,000 you said?
Yeah.
15% of that, so they'll get 3,000. And then of 3,000 Dalit animals. Thibault, last question.
Last question. Thank you for a great presentation, great work. I think I had seen an earlier iteration of the paper. The question I had for you is about the core voter idea, and especially relative to the first survey, the nationwide survey. So I know this actually came up in Faryad's comments about how could you even possibly disaggregate this to get more nuance in terms of who the core voters are. And this is probably more for your book project. I wonder if all those core voters care the same way or to the same extent. Because I can see very different groups of core voters. I could see wealthy people living in big cities who support the BJP because they see the BJP as much more competent, but I could also see a lot of very ideological voters, core voters, implying that the wealthy people may not be that ideological, like they may not be affiliated with the RSS and whatnot. And I could see other core voters, much more ideological, who could actually be quite happy to see that the BJP is reaching out to Dalits, because that's what the BJP is trying to do as part of the bigger project of building an ever bigger Hindu majority. So I wonder if you're planning to do, I don't think you have that in your paper,
no.
But I wonder whether this is something you will take into account in the future. And with the election coming up in a few months, this is something that is going to be interesting to look
Whether
at.
the new ideology will translate into an electoral strategy,
Yeah.
that's the,
Because I can see different types of core voters.
Yeah.
I could see very wealthy people who are not that ideological, who don't like the sort of like communalism. At the local
NES
level.
also reported, perhaps this goes in the same direction, NES also reported, Thibault and Shikhar, that 25% of BJP's vote, according to the voters, was a vote for Modi, not for BJP. So it goes in the same direction.
Yeah, that's why, because I think I asked you this question about Modi of specifically the sort of like charismatic appeal and how that played, right? How many of those core voters are just driven?
A lot of rich people might vote for him not for ideological
Exactly,
reasons.
yeah.
It's just Modi, right? 25% of voters,
Or
according to
even
NES.
even low-income voters.
Yeah.
Who may be high caste, but not specifically drawn to the RSS and
Yeah,
the Sangh,
correct.
who just like the guy because he is a pretty impressive public speaker and he speaks to their issues, and so they can relate. So there's that as well, I think, to some extent.
No, this is, I think, there are at least 3 buckets or conceptual categories here. One is the affluent, tax-paying, efficiency-oriented.
Yeah.
This is itself a bunch, but let's just say like that. The second is the ideological, which is the more expressive, focused on broader conceptions of the political community person. And the third is the in-group beneficiary, the one that Sebastian highlighted. And I think currently they're all lumped as one. The in-group beneficiary probably the least, because the sample skews in such a way that we're probably not catching them the most, but certainly the first two. And the implications are different, because the first set of people may have a problem with any redistributive program or inefficient redistribution. Efficiency here defined as money lost in like corruption, leakages, etc. So their support or opposition may hinge on a different point from those who see it as in terms of like a political community terms. And absolutely, like the empirical test of that would then disaggregate by these in the next iteration. But thank you.
We need more of that, I think. We don't have a clear sense of who the voters are in a way.
Well, it's time to bring this to a close. You can carry the conversation outside. There's a reception. But before we take Shikhar out for reception, it's time to thank him for a terrific